well-developed and productive apple tree such as this doesn't just happen. One of the key elements in producing a tree like this is pruning. In this tape, we'd like to give you a few tips on pruning apple trees, and we're going to begin with a discussion of the characteristics of a central leader tree.
There are a number of different ways that apple trees may be trained. The two primary systems are the central leader and modified central leader. The central leader system is the most widely recommended system in the Ohio Valley region. Many of the pruning techniques used in the development of the central leader tree are used in other training systems. The central leader tree has a maximum of horizontal fruiting wood and a minimum of heavy upright structural wood. The horizontal wood is structurally strong due to wide branch angles and is fruitful due to its horizontal position. The more we reduce the apple tree's branch angle from the trunk, the more it will tend to set fruit buds and to produce. However, if the branch is moved down to the horizontal position or below, it will tend to send up unproductive water sprouts along its length. Thus, a roughly 45 to 60 degree angle from the trunk is what we're aiming for. Fruit grown on a central leader tree is much less subject to limb rub and sunburn. In addition, less vertical wood matures earlier in the fall and is less subject to winter injury. The scaffold limbs are well balanced around the central leader to obtain maximum sunlight exposure and the maximum amount of fruiting wood. Scaffold limbs should fruit all the way back to the central leader and should be stout enough to carry the fruit load without propping.
Here we have a newly planted one-year-old apple tree, or one-year-old whip as it's termed in the industry. This is the ideal sized tree to plant because first of all it's small and that makes it survive well. It's also easier to plant. Second of all, these buds will break easily and develop scaffold limbs where we want them, which we would not get off of a 2- or 3-year-old tree. If you planted your tree in the fall, you want to wait till spring to prune it because of winter injury problems. Pruning at planting is extremely important, first of all, because most of the roots on this tree were lost in the nursery when they dug it. If we put a tree out like this and don't prune it, it'll leaf out, and then when the weather gets hot, those leaves will give off a lot of water. The roots won't be able to pump enough water up to the top of the tree, so that tree wilts and dies. If it doesn't wilt and die, then we get very weak growth during that season, a very poor tree. In pruning the tree, you want to make a heading back cut on that tree. And when you make a heading back cut, you'll get buds breaking 8 to 10 inches below where you make that cut. Now, if we head that tree high up here, what happens is we'll get very weak growth on that tree and not a very good tree. If we head it down low here, we'll get nice wide-angled branch angles and good vigorous tree. The ideal place to head a tree is at about a height of about 30 inches, right here. We're going to head right at this bud, just a little bit above the bud. Now, this will cause the scaffold limbs to develop in this area just above our rodent guard. Another thing a lot of growers do is they rub these two buds out right here, like this one and that one. Now, these two tend to give us narrow branch angles, and we generally have to cut those branches off later. By rubbing them out, it'll force these to grow out, and we'll get nice wide branch angles on that tree. Here we have a nice vigorous one-year-old tree, but it's got branches, and you can see one of the problems with trees with branches. They get broken off when they're shipped in. Well, we solve that problem by removing them, and on a tree like this, we'll cut all the lateral branches off. This gives you much more vigorous growth, and of course these buds will develop out here, and of course we're going to head the tree again at about 30 inches. If you had a 2-year-old tree that had vigorous branches on, you may want to leave a couple of those branches on the tree, head those back fairly severely, and also head your leader back, and that'll improve your survival on a tree like that. During the first growing season on a young apple tree in mid to late May, we have the opportunity to do a little extra training on the tree to save us some pruning later on and to develop a strong tree. First thing you want to do is remove any of this growth that's down inside your rodent guard, because we certainly don't want branches down there. And these rub off very easily when that tree is young and tender like this. Second, we want to pick about 5 good scaffold limbs on that tree that are well arranged around the tree. And there's one there, one there, one there, and one there, and one there. And we'll go with those. We're going to rub the rest of them off. Now this tree, we didn't remove the narrow angled, the two buds at the top, so you can see these branches are a little bit narrower, but we have a chance to adjust those when this tree is, let me get a better toothpick there. With just a round toothpick, we can push that into the branch and into the leader of the tree there. And that toothpick will stay there and it'll switch that narrow branch angle into a nice wide branch angle. We can also use clothespins by putting them on the leader and putting them right over top of that branch. And this will assure us nice strong branches. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. Okay, and when we prune this tree next spring, we'll remove one of these branches so that we have 4 nice ones. And so that tree's pretty well set, and that's going to give us a nice strong tree. If you use clothespins, you want to make sure you remove those after about a month and a half when that angle is set. We can't change this angle on this branch much after this time of the year or next spring. So once we get that set, we're in good shape.
The less a young tree is pruned, the earlier it'll begin pruning, but we have to do some pruning to establish a basic framework to develop a structurally strong tree. If you didn't do summer pruning and pinching last summer, as was not done on this tree, you need to begin by selecting your scaffold limbs. Scaffold limbs should have a nice wide angle with the trunk so that it's structurally strong, and you also want them well arranged around the tree, and you do not want 2 scaffold limbs over top of each other. Begin by putting your spreaders in, because if you break a branch off while putting a spreader in, if you've already pruned a tree, you're down to 3 branches. I've selected this branch, this one, and this one down here. I've selected this branch over this one because we want a little bit more separation of those branches on the trunk if we can get it. Now what we'll do initially is remove the branches with the narrow branch angles. This one and the one around back. Be careful when you're pruning these, because once that branch is off of there, it's gone. And let's see, with that one like that. Now we've got 4 good scaffold limbs. This one is the longest. We've spread it out to take a little of the vigor out of it, and we're going to head that one a little harder. Now I'm just going to barely head these branches here to encourage a little bit of lateral branching. And then up here where we don't want a limb, we're going to remove that. You'll notice that we've got our first scaffold limbs beginning at least 18 inches off the ground. You don't want them any closer to the ground than that. We've got a 45 to 60 degree angle here with the trunk on all of our scaffold limbs, and we've headed these scaffold limbs very little. You don't normally want to head that scaffold limb much more than a quarter. The reason for that is if you head it much more, we'll get very vigorous growth that doesn't tend to set or develop spurs very well, whereas a light heading will give us our best lateral branching that we're after on this tree. Sometimes you get a tree that doesn't have 4 good scaffold limbs. What do you do to develop a limb on a tree that only has 3 limbs? Well, you can come in with your knife and pick a bud out. Let's say we want a limb right there. You can come in right over top of that bud and make a little bit of a slice. Take a little notch out. Now what that does is interrupt the oxygen supply coming down from the top of the tree that inhibits this lateral bud break. So that'll make this bud break and grow and develop a branch there. Remember, in buds that you induce to break like this, a lot of times that shoot will be very vigorous and it'll have a narrow angle. So you'll need to come back in here in June and put a toothpick in there to develop a nice wide angle on that one. The last thing you want to do is head your central leader, and you want to head the leader roughly about 2 feet, 2.5 feet above your first whirl of scaffold limbs. And so up here we're just going to take the tip out of this tree, and there's a terminal bud that's going to grow. Now a little trick you can do is to rub off these next 2 buds that tend to give you very narrow scaffold limbs, and this will alleviate having these grow and waste the tree's energy. These will tend to come out with nice wide limbs, and we'll get our second tier of scaffolds. On the tree that's grown in the orchard for 2 seasons, we're going to begin by placing spreaders in the upper scaffold limbs that I've already selected and we'll talk about in a few minutes to get good angles on them. Now this tree has surprisingly excellent angles and it doesn't need any other spreaders. We're going to begin down on the lower scaffold limbs. We've got 4 excellent limbs with good angles. They're developing good structural strength. Again, we'll take off a vertical shoot that's going straight up, and we're going to leave these laterals. You'll notice the spurs that are beginning to develop on this limb. We're just going to head this lightly and move over to the next limb. This one's growing a little weaker. All this needs is a little tipping at the end and to take that vertical one off there. Over on this scaffold limb, we've got one going up vertically on the limb there, one there. We'll remove that. We're just going to head this one lightly to get it to form some lateral branches to develop some more spur structure. And we're going to head this one a little harder because it's one of the larger limbs to make it the same length as the other ones. Finally, on the last limb, we've got a lateral limb that's going up very straight. And it's getting to the point where it's almost competing with our leader. So we're going to cut to a lateral right here to this one that's got a fruit bud on the end. And that'll develop our fruit structure here in one plane. Here's another vertical one on top of the limb. There's one underneath of the limb that we're going to take off, and we're going to just tip this lightly right there. Now we've got an extra limb right there that comes out of there. Now we're done with the lower world of scaffold limbs. Up in the top of the tree, we're going to treat this just like we treated the tree after the first growing season. I've selected 4 limbs, this one, this one, this one, and this one. We're going to remove a narrow branch angle limb right there that'll tend to break out of the tree. This is a nice limb, but it's so vigorous in comparison with the others, it'll be difficult for us to maintain uniform branching between the others. So we've selected 4 limbs now, and they're fairly well arranged around the tree. We're going to head these lightly again, making sure we keep these upper limbs shorter than the lower ones. And notice that we want to have the tip of that limb the highest part on the limb. We're going to head that one lightly, then back up here on our central leader. This one could be a little bit higher. We're going to just barely head it a little bit, rub the next 2 buds off, and develop another ring of scaffolds right there for next year. And that's all you have to do after the second season of growth in the field. After 3 years of growth in the orchard, a young, vigorous tree can be ready to bear fruit. Now, if your tree isn't vigorous enough, you want to make sure that you don't fruit it too early. You may want to wait another year. If you fruit a tree too early, it can destroy the shape of the tree that you've worked so hard to develop, and it can also cause the tree to runt out or stunt the tree so that it won't grow properly. This is particularly a problem with some of the spur types, like spur type Arkansas Black. We would like a young bearing tree to be moderately vigorous with a nice balance of vegetative and fruiting wood. This is a very vigorous tree because of a wet season we had last year, and you can see that some of the growth on this tree is excessive. As a result, we want to do a few things to help bring it into bearing a little bit more next year, even though it does have quite a few spurs already started on it. First of all, we'll reduce the amount of nitrogen, probably roughly by half on this tree. We'll spread the limbs to reduce the vigor and induce spur formation. And finally, we're going to prune this tree as lightly as possible. You want to begin by putting your spreaders in like we do every season when you prune a tree. We've already installed a few in this tree, and we'll put the last couple in. Get those limbs spread out to that 45 to 60 degree angle. Let's see here. There we go. Don't want to get them too flat, otherwise we'll get a lot of vegetative growth on the limb. Okay, now we want to start out on the lower scaffold limbs, and we'll remove any of the strong, vigorous growth that's growing vertically, and we'll remove any weak hanging growth, and there's not too much on this tree. Next we'll remove any limbs that have very narrow branch angles that are liable to break. And we're going to use mostly thinning out cuts on this tree rather than heading back cuts. Okay, we're going to start by removing the suckers at the base here. Okay, here's another vigorous shoot. We're going to head this lightly here. This lateral. Hit all these laterals very lightly to encourage more lateral branching. Some of the weaker ones we'll leave unheaded. This one's fairly vigorous. We're going to try to keep that there by heading it lightly. And remember, here's our leader on the branch, and we want to keep this about the same length as the other scaffold limb. So we're going to head this one lightly like that to encourage some more branching up here. Now we've got the 4 lower scaffold limbs pruned on the tree, and we're going to leave these shoots that are coming off intermediately here. Now up in the second whirl of limbs, we're going to begin by just tipping that one lightly. This is a very vigorous one. It should have had a bigger spreader put on it last year, but we didn't get it. If I spread it much more, it's liable to break off the tree. And hit him about there. Here's a vertical one on this limb, and just tip that lightly. We're going to just very barely tip that one because we want this one to catch up with these other scaffolds. Here's an unusual shaped limb. It's a little difficult to prune something like that. I'm going to just clip the top off of it like that and just barely head that. Now up in the top of the tree here we've got our leader, and the tree's sort of leaning this way, so I'm going to pick this as our leader on the tree and remove this narrow angled one right here, and then just lightly head these other 3 scaffolds. Now we'd like to have another small scaffold limb in there. We can modify that by again making a little cut on a bud, and we'll just make a couple cuts here. Maybe one like that over top of this bud, and we'll pick one over on the other side here. Whoops. Okay. Now we've got to head our leader on the tree, and about 2.5 feet up, we'll head that to get another ring of scaffold limbs. So now you see what we've got on this tree, and on an ideal tree we'd like to have 4 nice scaffold limbs well arranged around the base of the tree, a second ring of 3 or 4 scaffold limbs about 2 feet up from that, and then about 2 feet up from this one we'd like to have another ring of 4 scaffold limbs. We've only got 3 here. We're hoping for a 4th one, and ultimately these intermediate ones will come out when this tree gets much bigger. You can see we've still left a number of spurs and fruit buds on the tree here to help bring this into a good fruit production phase of its growth. Once again, we've spread the tree out. We've removed strong vertical growths off the limb. We've maintained our dominance on the limbs with keeping the tip of the limb as the highest point on the limb. We've lightly headed the laterals to encourage lateral branching and fruit production. And this tree is, again, well balanced and ready to grow for this season. This tree's been in the orchard for 5 years and has been fruiting for 2 years. It has a fairly well-developed framework now. We'll use primarily thinning out cuts on this tree to reduce the development of extra branching in the interior of the tree, which would lead to more pruning in subsequent years and a reduction of light into the interior. As in previous years, we're still heading some of the scaffold limbs to induce a little additional branching out on the periphery of the tree and to keep all of the scaffold limbs in a tier about the same length. Again, we've maintained the dominance of the leader on each scaffold limb by keeping it the highest point on the limb. We've also removed any vertical shoots and hanging shoots that block the penetration of light into the tree. We've shortened the longest lateral limbs arising off the scaffold limbs and have left plenty of fruiting wood inside the tree. In the top of the tree, we've maintained our central leader as the highest part of the tree and headed it. We've also maintained the pyramidal shape of the tree by shortening the upper tiers of scaffold limbs and installing spreaders.
Work on our central leader a little bit. We're sort of losing our central leader here. This is the main leader on the tree and this one's sort of taken over. So we've got to work on that and prune him back a little bit. So let's do that. We're going to head this one back pretty hard and make a couple heading back cuts in here. There, we're cutting to another spur. Again, clean this up right here. Again, cutting to another spur and lateral. What we're doing is just trying to thin it out a little bit up top here, and I'm going to head that one lightly. We want this to take off and dominate. Now we've got that below our leader up here, and what we do on the top of the tree here is try to keep this the highest part on the tree, and we don't have a whole lot of vigor up here, so that's fine. When you get that tree up about as high as you want it, you got to keep all these others down below, and we can hold the height of this tree about right here. So we're going to take him off right here, make this the leader of our tree for this year. We're trying to keep the height down a little bit. Prune that out and head that back a little bit. So next year we'll probably come in and pick another leader out up here. Okay, on the back side of the tree, turn around here, gotta work this limb over. Remember, we've got to keep these limbs up here shorter than the ones down below, and since these are closer to the sunlight, a lot of times they grow a little bit more, so we've got to be a little tougher in the top of the tree. Getting a little bit, well, that's doing pretty good. We're going to just head that one just lightly. Cut to a lateral there. Okay, this is competing with our leader here, so we've got to cut that one back. Let's stand back and take a look at this a little bit here. That one's heading in a little bit too far. Shorten that up a little bit, bring that in. There's always a few more branches you could cut on a tree, but I think I'd call it quits on this one. Notice how we've opened it up pretty well so the sunlight can come in here. Another year we may take another branch out of here as we get some more up here to get more sunlight in, but we've maintained that pyramidal shape to the tree. This is the highest part on the tree. It may not look like it from down below, but that is the highest part on the tree, and we want that to dominate and be our central leader.